The Jets have made a number of additions on offense during the offseason, but there's still time to add more, especially in the upcoming NFL draft. What will the Jets be looking for on offense in the draft? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, April 11th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, today we're going to talk about the upcoming NFL draft, just a couple of weeks away now. And we're going to talk about what the Jets may be looking for on the offensive side of the ball. Now, the Jets have been very active this offseason, trying to improve what was one of the worst offenses in the league last year and what's been one of the worst offenses in the league for quite a while. Obviously, the return of Aaron Rodgers should provide a boost at the most important position, but the Jets have also been busy adding players on the offensive line. They've been busy adding Mike Williams at the wide receiver position. The offense that takes the field week one this year should be better on paper than the offense that took the field week one last year when the Jets, thought that they had a team that was going places. And in retrospect, in part because of injuries, in part because players they were counting on really weren't good or got injured, the offense was not very good. Despite the additions the Jets made, there's still time and there's still room for the team to improve its offense further. And there are roles that the Jets are going to be looking to fill. We're going to look at some of the roles, and we're going to go position by position through the offense. We're going to start in the backfield, and we'll start at the most important position, quarterback. And unlike many NFL drafts in the last, 15 years or so, the Jets are not looking for a starting quarterback this year. Rodgers will be under center. In fact, they're not even really looking for a backup quarterback because they got Tyron Taylor. After the Zach Wilson experience last year, there was maybe the biggest guarantee heading into the Jets offseason was that they were going to go get a veteran backup because of what happened last year with Zach Wilson needing to take the reins after Rodgers' injury. We knew that the Jets were not going to trust another young quarterback after that the Jets were going to react by adding a veteran backup. All the buzz, though, seems to suggest that the New York Jets are going to draft a quarterback, and it's probably going to be in day 3 this year. And it's going to be somebody who's going to be more of a developmental type quarterback. It's somebody who will be the third quarterback. And, last year the NFL made a rule change, and they essentially allowed teams to have a bonus player active on game day as long as it was the third quarterback. And this was a rule that existed in a different form prior to 2011, and then the league changed things. So essentially, it's a bonus player. He doesn't count against your allotment of active players. You can only activate 47 to 48 players on game day. The third quarterback, as long as the third quarterback does not count against the allotment of 47 to 48. And the Jets, like many other teams, I'm surprised how many teams did not take advantage of this every game last year. In fact, for a decent part of the Jets season, they only had 2 active quarterbacks. And they only two quarterbacks on the 53-man roster. Is essentially like throwing away a free roster spot every game. And it's kind of an insurance policy because while there's no team that's going to play at a high level with its third string quarterback, there's a big difference between having a third string quarterback where you can at least run a shell of your offense. You can at least run an NFL offense in some capacity versus, having to run wildcat or having having a wide receiver who played quarterback in college under center. But beyond that, I think the Jets are going to look for somebody who won't just play the third quarterback role, somebody they can look to develop over the long run. And I think mistakenly, whoever the Jets draft, and it certainly sounds like they're going to draft somebody, this person will be called the heir apparent to Rodgers. When in reality, this is going to be a player who, with tools that they like, it's going to be somebody that they're hoping to groom in some capacity. Maybe it's going to be as a starter. Maybe it's going to be as a backup. But it's not necessarily somebody they think is going to be somebody who has a high percentage odds of becoming a starter in the future. Because if they thought that if anybody you think is going to have a good chance of becoming a starter in the future is going to be drafted probably day 1 or day 2. Day 3 is more for the projects, guys you're hoping to develop. And if you hit on them, it's great. but you're not really investing a whole lot in somebody who's a fourth round pick or a fifth round pick, sixth, seventh round pick at the quarterback position. But it certainly sounds like that's the direction the Jets are going to go in. Rodgers is going to be the starter. Tyrod Taylor is going to be the second quarterback. Zach Wilson's still on the roster at this point as we record this podcast. He'll probably, I would guess, he'll be traded at some point during the NFL draft, if not before. And I think the Jets are probably going to look for a third developmental quarterback. They're not going to look to draft anybody early, whether that's right or wrong. And I think that there is a strong case to be made for the Jets drafting somebody and sitting them year one so that they're ready to go. So they'll have their ready-made starter once Rodgers retires. I think they're more likely to draft somebody in the later rounds for the role of the third quarterback and to become a developmental kind of guy. More significant, I think the Jets, another spot the Jets are somewhat likely to draft a player this year in the late rounds is the running back position, because after Breece Hall, it's really not clear what the Jets have at the position. They do have Izzy Abanikanda, who was a late round pick a year ago, but he didn't really play that much last year, and I didn't think he was that impressive when he got the opportunity. And granted, Jets' offensive line was a mess last year, so I don't know how much you can really judge a running back by that. Breece Hall had struggles at points last year. Breece Hall, I think, is a running back as talented as any of the elite backs in the NFL. There were even moments where Breece was really struggling. But that second running back role, it's kind of up in the air. The Jets tried with Dalvin Cook last year, and that did not work very well. Late in the season, they kind of put Cook on the sideline. They tried to get their younger guys going, but didn't really work out. I think Izzy Abanikanda will have an opportunity to win the second running back role, but I don't think there's really anything at this point in time that would tell you that he's a lock for that role. I don't think there's anything at this point in time that would tell you that the Jets should definitely give him that role without any sort of competition. I think it's just a good practice in general to try and bring in a young running back every year. It's one of those spots where, especially when you're talking about like a day 3 pick in the 4th, 5th round range, your odds of finding a running back are probably better there than they are at a lot of other positions, like say wide receiver, like say pass rusher. And that's because running back's just not really a high value position in the NFL anymore. Part of this is, due to data, where we now know how important an offensive line is in a running back success. And it's not even, you don't even necessarily need to look at data 100% because you can look at the struggles Breece Hall had at points last year. I mean, a lot of Breece's struggles, I can guarantee you, weren't about Breece. They were about the guys who were blocking up front. But beyond that, the NFL's kind of de-emphasized the running back position. Teams have kind of found it's a best practice, except for exceptional backs. And I would argue the Jets have an exceptional back, and they're even going to give a second running back a fair share of carries. It makes sense to rotate guys in and out. You don't want to wear running backs down. Breece is a guy the Jets are going to hope to maintain over the next couple of years. You don't want to run Breece into the ground so that he's completely used up. Your running backs have a certain shelf life in this league, so you don't want to put too many miles on Breece's odometer, and you want to give him a break within games. And I think one of the ways to do that is you draft somebody every year, and you hope you hit on gold, because again, when you're talking day 3, there aren't a lot of players who hit, but your odds, generally speaking, are better at the running back position than they are at other spots. So I don't think there's anything wrong, even if you're an Izzy Abanikanda fan. I don't think that there's anything wrong with bringing in a new back this year, letting him compete with Izzy in training camp in the preseason for that number 2 role behind Breece, and whoever wins. If both guys produce, which probably not going to happen, but if both guys look good, you have depth, and depth is always a very good thing in the NFL. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the pass-catching positions. We've talked about the guys in the backfield. What are the Jets going to look for at wide receiver and tight end? I have some thoughts on that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. How about that? $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Baseball season's underway in New York. Yankees lost a tough one yesterday, but they're off to a pretty good start. Mets trying to get things back on track. Some of the local teams in hockey and basketball are making runs for the playoffs. And again, on FanDuel, you can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon, and make your first bet an automatic win with that $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes. And when we need them, if news breaks, if some major development happens, we'll have a bonus episode here or there. And of course, if you're watching or listening to the show, you like Locked On, you may also be watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, and you may have to turn down the volume with all that shouting. Well, then make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about what the Jets may be looking for, what roles they're looking to fill in the upcoming NFL draft. So let's talk about the wide receiver position. And on paper, this position is a lot stronger than it was a year ago, just because you have Mike Williams in the starting role over Allen Lazard. A year ago, we had Garrett Wilson as your number one receiver. We knew Garrett was going to be good. Another 1,000-yard season, 2 for 2 since he entered the league. Tough to say anything bad about Garrett. Last year, entering the season, Lazard was our number 2 receiver. That was not good. And, the whole Corey Davis saga was going on, but we had Lazard, we had Randall Cobb. It was really baffling to think that the Jets went into their season with that a crew as their starting group at the wide receiver position. They have added Mike Williams. What they don't really have right now is a guy who's a reliable third option. Now, I think you actually can make an argument that Lazard in the number 3 role, he might be fine. And that might be a controversial take. Look, Lazard is your number 3 guy. If you look through his production through his career, at least going back to Green Bay, he's been a functional number 3. He's not a great number 3 option. He could be fine as a number 3. The problem, though, is that you're dealing with Mike Williams coming off an injury, and you're one injury away from Mike Williams being back where you were a year ago. And also, as things currently stand, I'm assuming Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams are primarily going to play on the outside. So maybe you're talking about a slot receiver, or you're talking about Xavier Gibson seeing a significant amount of snaps. Well, that's not very appetizing for the New York Jets. So I think you're looking for a more reliable third option. I think if we're talking about drafting somebody at the 10 spots, you're probably looking, first of all, for somebody who in the near run gives you a little insurance. If you draft a Roma Dunze or a Malik Neighbors, you're not as panicked about the idea of one of your top receivers going down, because then you have a high-end prospect who could step into that second role, and you could be fine. And I've talked about this a little bit yesterday, how it's kind of a perfect spot for a young receiver to step into, because you're not expecting too much of them off the bat. If they give you like the typical 500 yards, a receiver drafted in that range gives you as a rookie, that's pretty good for a number 3 receiver. And if he produces, you're still going to see a fair amount of playing time. So that receiver's ready for more, having extra receiver depth is not a problem. Mike Williams gets bumped down into like the third option role, and he's an excellent overqualified third option. So, that's one area where they think the Jets are going to look to upgrade their group. I think another area where the Jets clearly could look to upgrade their group is just the idea of adding a young receiver. Because when we're talking about young talent, we're thinking about down the line, Jets don't really have much beyond Garrett. Now, through much of the history of this podcast, we've been going back to 2016. Jets did not even have like one premium receiver like Garrett. Only having one, though, isn't enough. So I think the Jets need to think about their future. And I think this is also true. We'll get to the tackles in a little bit. By signing Mike Williams, the Jets gave themselves a good stopgap. The Jets have taken wide receiver out of the crisis range in the current scenario. But in the longer-term scenario, Jets still have to address that spot. So I think that's another area the Jets are going to look to add. And I also think the Jets just need to add some speed at the wide receiver position. I think and look, it may not work out that way. And I'm a big believer that you look for quality over style at receiver. If you have 2 receivers who are really good, who play the same style of football, that's perfectly fine. But I do think there's something to the idea the Jets could use a little bit more speed. I guess on paper, Gibson's fast, but didn't really use that speed all that much last year, except for that punt return against Buffalo week 1. So I think that that's an area where the Jets could look to upgrade. How about tight ends? Well, obviously one area where the Jets very well may look to add a tight end is not so much a role, but just look to add more talent. There's a lot of buzz about Brock Bowers being a pick to the Jets, and I've spoken extensively about that, about how risky I think that would be, about how if you look at the odds, I don't love the option so much. But if you look at what they have right now, Tyler Conklin is fine. Tyler Conklin's not exciting. Tyler Conklin's not a game changer. Tyler Conklin's a guy who And a good offense is kind of like a role player. He's kind of an afterthought. If you look at his production last year, the 600 or so yards he had, I think part of that was just the Jets didn't really have receivers they could throw the ball to. So that kind of like led Conklin to get more volume than is ideal in a typical offense. I keep reading like this idea that because Rodgers is back now, Conklin's going to explode for 1,000 yards. And I mean, I don't know that I believe that. I think that, with better other options in the passing game, Conklin's efficiency could go up. I mean, he may not take as many targets to get 600 yards this year, but I don't think he's going to see the same volume. I mean, I don't think he's going to get the ball thrown to him as much as he did last year. And if he is, then that's a problem, because I do think part of the volume Conklin got a year ago was based on the Jets not really having viable wide receiver options. And Conklin was also used pretty extensively as a check down option. So, if guys weren't getting open down the field, Zach Wilson, or whoever the quarterback was, would just check it down to Conklin for a shorter gain. But if we're talking Bowers, I think the expectations clearly he's got to be for him to be one of the best tight ends in the NFL, because you're not taking a tight end in the NFL. The top 10 to just be okay. So I think like there's always an argument to be made that even if you're okay at a position, adding a premium talent would make it worth it. And I don't think there's any question, as skeptical as I am about the Bowers pick, if he actually is as good as advertised, and he actually becomes like one of the top 3 tight ends in the NFL, the pick would definitely be worth it. My skepticism is more based on the idea that you're projecting a player to be a top 3 guy at this position. That's always a shaky estimation to make. And historically at the tight end position, lots of teams have had trouble scouting it, and lots of teams have had trouble pinpointing these players. And I'm not sure the Jets are an exception to that rule, but if Bowers is really good, he's a guy who could add an extra element to the passing game. So that's the first area the Jets may look to add at the tight end position. Another area the Jets may look to add is blocking. And I know people will scoff at this because, CJ Uzomah wasn't a great player, but CJ Uzomah was, for the most part, a pretty solid blocker. And I know people are going to talk about Jeremy Ruckert stepping into that role, but I think if you look at what Ruckert's done in his career, there are some highlight reel blocks. And I think that's what people look at, because, if you go on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, you'll see like some highlight reel where Ruckert's pancaking somebody or Ruckert's throwing somebody out of the way. But if you look at Ruckert on a play-to-play basis, it's been kind of inconsistent. It hasn't been that great. Again, there's some real highlight blocks, but what you want is more consistency. I mean, I would take somebody who has less spectacular blocks, less blocks where he dominates his guys, and if it meant you're hitting your assignment on a more consistent basis. I think part of the reason Ruckert has some of those highlight reel blocks is sometimes he's a little out of control. Sometimes he doesn't use great technique, and that leads you to, like, when you're that aggressive, when you're overly aggressive, when you're not using great technique, sometimes you really hit on your block, but sometimes you really miss. And I think Ruckert's kind of been, missed. So, like, I'm talking late rounds here. I mean, I don't think you draft a blocking tight end in the first 3 rounds, but if we're talking late rounds, we're talking about players with more limited skill sets, and that could be a spot where maybe the Jets look to add a tight end if they don't draft Bowers in the first round. Look, I don't think it's likely the Jets are going to draft 2 tight ends this year. So if they draft Bowers in the first round, they may just go with what they've got. But if they don't draft Bowers at 10, I think maybe you look to a blocking tight end later on in the late rounds, especially maybe with one of those 7th round picks. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the trenches. What will the Jets be looking for on the offensive line? I'll give you some thoughts continuing this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Thursday, we're talking about what the Jets may look for on offense in the NFL draft, which is coming up just a couple of weeks away. It'll be another Thursday night first round, rounds 2 and 3 Friday night, rounds 4 through 7 Saturday afternoon. I don't know if it's exciting, but it's certainly a critical part of team building. And we've been talking today about what roles the Jets are going to look to fill on their offense in the NFL draft. We've saved the trenches for last. And when you're talking about building an offense, the trenches are certainly not last. But on today's show, we're finishing by talking about what the Jets are going to look for on the offensive line. And I'm going to repeat myself, something I've been saying over and over. You may be tired of hearing it if you're an everydayer, but I'm going to keep repeating it because it's really important. And I keep repeating the things that are really important. On the offensive line right now, at the tackle position, the New York Jets have what are probably going to be the third and fourth oldest starting tackles in the league. Now, the quality could be very good. And when I say this, I'm not guaranteeing that like Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses are going to decline this year, but I'm thinking ahead. And I understand everybody wants to say win now, Jets are all in, and fine, that's all true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that doesn't mean you should ignore every single thing about your future. You can occasionally, even when you're all in, even when you're win now, even when you go into extremes like the Jets have, you can every now and then do something to think of your future. And the Jets are going to need to find solutions at the tackle position, at least one of them. And it's going to have to happen sooner rather than later because, yeah, I get it. All in for 2024. Well, 2025 is going to get here at some point. And we're not talking 3 years down the line. When I say think about the future, I'm talking about 1 year from now. So at 10, I think tackle's got to be a consideration. And you could say, well, you're drafting a backup. Well, again, you're dealing with the third and fourth oldest starting tackles in the league, one of whom has been a pretty big injury risk, one of whom has missed at least 3 games every season since 2016. So you can't sit there and tell me it's not a move for now. You can't tell me about it's a move for the distant future. First of all, whoever you draft at 10 is going to be slated to be a starter next year. Also, whoever you draft at 10, if it's a tackle, probably going to get pretty extensive playing time this year. It could be a critical player because you got a 40-year-old quarterback who's not going to be able to move that well. And you're one injury away from having a real problem at the tackle position. Which leads me to the second thing I think the Jets are going to focus on the offensive line. I think this is going to be more mid-rounds. If we could be talking the 3rd round pick, we could be talking like one of the 2 4th round picks. We could even be talking about one of the 7th round picks. But when we talk about depth on the offensive line, there's a way it's built in the NFL. And I don't think people pay close enough attention to it. It's not done through free agent signings. I mean, every year some team signs some guy who's like a veteran and they say, oh, our depth is filled now. Jets have done this a lot. I mean, I remember I hate to pick one guy to like kind of pick on, but like Brent Quale, remember that dude? Jets kept re-signing him every single year, and they acted like our depth is fine. Of course, my favorite one was Ben Ajalana. If you're a longtime listener, you may remember how much I loved that contract the Jets gave him back in 2017. It's just a ridiculous contract. You don't do it through veterans. Guys who hit free agency, if they're any good, typically get starting roles because there's a shortage of quality offensive linemen in this league. And that means like once somebody hits the open market and they're good, they're going to get a starting job somewhere. 9 times out of 10. I mean, there are the like exceptions like Morgan Moses a few years back when the Jets signed him the first time back in 2021. It was just like a strange confluence of events where he got cut very late in the calendar and the Jets happened to be like one of the few teams with cap space. So they were able to bring him in as a backup and he ended up, I mean, Jets won 4 games that year. So I don't know if you can say he was that important, but he ended up, the Jets certainly were better off on the offensive line, much better off on the offensive line for having Morgan Moses than they would have been without him. But generally speaking, it's tough to fill our offensive line depth in free agency. It's got to be done through the draft, and it's got to be done through those mid-round picks. And part of this is going to be hoping you coach up Carter Warren this year, hopefully. And I mean, it's part of the problem with this is that there's another Carter on the Jets offense, Keith Carter, who's just not a very good coach. We got a mailbag. I actually got a mailbag question a few weeks back about Keith Carter, about what makes him such a bad coach other than players complaining about him. And the answer is like, I mean, you can just see it. I'd say, I'm not going to say watch the film. I mean, just watch the game. When you've seen the games, how many times do you see a replay where the analyst says, well, the Jets really look confused in their assignments there. I mean, he's just not a good guy at implementing an offensive line scheme, and he's not a good guy at developing talent. But I mean, Jets need to do it. Jets need to find. I mean, I don't have a lot of faith in this coach, this position coach, but you still have to find guys in the middle to late rounds and develop them. And I think every good offensive line, for the most part, has 1 or 2 guys who's been developed into a starter. But short of that, you need guys who are quality backups. You need guys who can get you through like a 3-game stretch when one of your starters goes down. And you're not going to be able to do it signing guys in free agency. It's got to be done through the draft, finding some guys who fit your scheme well, finding some guys who have the attributes you can develop. It's a lot of it's scouting, a lot of it's coaching. And part of the reason the Jets have had such rough line depth recently is that they really haven't had great success in either area. And that's got to change because, We can talk about the Jets' bad luck on offensive line injuries the last couple of years, and it's been bad. Listen, there's no question about it, but offensive line injuries are a fact of life in the NFL. It's a physical position. It's a position where you have lots of bodies rolling around. It's really easy to get your leg rolled on because there's so much congestion in your area. When you're playing up front and getting hit on every single play, you need to have depth. And I think that's going to be another one of the focus. We can talk about the starters. And listen, the Jets need to figure out the starting tackle positions past 24. And again, I don't think that's a direct competition with the idea that they're all in and a win now team. You can think a little bit about the future, but the Jets also need to focus on improving their offensive line depth, and it can only be done through the draft. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.